Well, thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to get us started off. I'm Rishi Goyal, Director of the Medical Humanities major, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, where we house the Medical Humanities major and the Heyman Center for the Humanities. We've been doing a series of talks under the title or heading of Explorations in Medical Humanities, kind of more over the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, but I think they've gained some traction and some interest, especially over the last year or two. I think the pandemic in particular sort of reminded everyone, taught us, or kind of revealed the ways in which social and humanistic factors matter as much as biologic ones in terms of the outcomes and the experience of illness and disease. As we have kind of constituted or developed our medical humanities major, part of the question is kind of what is the medical humanities, or what is it for, or what is it doing? I was in a meeting today with the dean of our medical school who said, interdisciplinarity is all really good and well, but kind of how do we measure what we are calling interdisciplinarity, or the success of interdisciplinarity? And for me, what I always point to, at least in one way, is certain outcomes, and the book talks are kind of a perfect example of that. Professor Wailoo's work has been with us for a number of decades now, and it's an incredibly important projection, experience, representation of the kinds of work that can be done under the heading of medical humanities. At least I would like to call it that way. For us, the medical and health humanities is a heterogeneous group of methods and ideas that engage the humanities and the social science disciplines, such as history, literature, anthropology, sociology. But along with those, scientific disciplines like biology, genetics, neuroscience, and biomedical engineering. These diverse fields are marshaled to emphasize a set of common principles that extend across disciplines, including an acknowledgement of the vulnerability of human bodies, an adoption of anti-essentialist approaches to biology, a sensitivity to discourse, rhetorical, and historical approaches that reflect how ideas about the body and health come to circulate and gain cultural traction. Before we started, I mentioned to Professor Wailoo, I've been teaching his Dying in the City of Blues, sickle cell anemia, and the politics of race and health for a number of years. But I teach it across both my undergraduates, my medical students, and my residents. As an ER physician who treats sickle cell anemia or patients with vaso-occlusive crises in an urban ER, understanding the kind of politics and symbolic meaning of racialized diseases is incredibly important. And it's striking how, when we start to think about what kind of the authenticity of pain means, it sort of staggers kind of clinicians in the field to understand that they may not fully understand what the kind of racial and historical biases that they may be bringing to the table are. So it's been incredibly important for myself and my teaching. I'm really thrilled to have Professor Dodman here as our kind of interlocutor and moderator. Thomas mentioned to me that Keith had come up with a new book and that he would love to bring it to us to kind of showcase. And it was an obvious and easy thing to do because Thomas's work also kind of speaks to the same ways in which diseases both come into existence and then disappear, and they are historicized, and ways in which they kind of come to matter and disappear. So if you haven't, kind of what nostalgia was, War Empire in the Time of a Deadly Emotion is an incredibly important work to kind of understand these questions of how diseases come to kind of be recognized and then disappeared. So I'm going to hand it off to Professor Dodman to introduce Keith, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you, Rishi. Thank you all for being here. Good evening. Keith, so I'm going to introduce Keith Wailoo, our guest this evening, and then he's going to give a talk, and then we'll have some questions at the end. Keith Wailoo is Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He is the current president of the American Association for the History of Medicine and has been elected to the National Academy of Medicine, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, among many other academic honors. A historian of medicine and health policy as they intersect with drug use, racial disparities, and other forms of biopolitics, Professor Wailoo is the author of numerous books, which have in turn won innumerable awards. Among these, I'll just mention Dying in the City of Blues, which has already been mentioned, Sickle Cell Anemia and the Politics of Race and Health, published by University of North Carolina Press in 2001, How Cancer Crossed the Color Line, published by Oxford University Press in 2011, and Pain, A Political History, published by Johns Hopkins in 2015. In 2021, Professor Wailoo received the Dan David Prize for, and I quote, his influential body of historical scholarship focused on race, science, and health equity, on the social implications of medical innovation, and on the politics of disease. This is a very fitting description for his most recent publication, Pushing Kool, Big Tobacco, Racial Marketing, and the Untold Story of the Menthol Cigarette, published this past November by the University of Chicago Press, and which I had the pleasure of coming across on a display table in Labyrinth Books in Princeton right when it came out. I was immediately and totally engrossed by the book's first lines, which I'm going to read right now. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s in the era of blaxploitation, a term coined during my early years, describing a new genre of Black-themed films like Superfly that trafficked in garish stereotypes of urban street life filled with criminality, sex, and new heights of coolness. Now, as you can imagine, I obviously could not relate to this particular experience. However, a few lines down, the next passage I could relate to. At some point between life in the Bronx and in Queens, where we moved next, I also became alert to another kind of push, the messages emanating from cigarette billboards. They were everywhere. New York was saturated with tobacco posters on buses and subways. Massive billboards lined streets and highways, featuring their own stark and stereotypical fantasies that pushed a popular and lethal drug. These lines suddenly conjured memories of similar billboards and red and white Formula One cars that I saw as a European kid and that peddled dreams of a distant mythical place called America. I put aside whatever I was reading at the time and jumped into the book to follow Keefe's detective investigation of how menthol smoking and a taste for menthol cigarettes was invented and successively repackaged by tobacco companies and a web of deceiving pushers, predatory interests, and unlikely influences as healthy and uplifting, feminine and masculine, urbanite and cool, civically oriented, and especially authentically Black. And forgive the ambulance just coming down Amsterdam Avenue. It is therefore a great pleasure for me to welcome Keef Wailoo, virtually at least, to Columbia this evening for a presentation of Pushing Kool as part of our explorations in the Medical Humanities Books Talks series. After the talk, there will be some time for questions. You should see a Q&A box on your screen where you can submit your question to me and I will read it out loud. But for now, please join me in welcoming Professor Keef Wailoo.
Thank you, Thomas, for that introduction, and Rishi for the invitation to be here. I really look forward to this conversation, and I'll just get started here. Sorry, hold on, I'm just gonna hide my video panel. Sorry. There we go. As Thomas suggested, I'll just give a short overview of the book, and I would love to just have a conversation about it. After all, we write books to encourage conversations. And one of the things I would say about my book in relationship to the enterprise of medical humanities is this, that so much of medical humanities and so much of my own writing has focused historically on medical thinking, medical practice, and ideas about disease, ideas about pain, and also the disparities between the ways in which physicians and healthcare practitioners conceptualize pain and how patients experience pain. In taking up a book on the history of menthol cigarettes, it strikes me that I started the story of health in a completely different place than in my previous work. I was interested in this project not only in a consumer product, but also, one might say, in the kind of structural ways in which the consumer marketplace produces health or produces infirmity well upstream of the clinical manifestations of health. And so this is what makes this book both in conversation with my past works on the medical humanities, but also a distinct type, pushing Kool. So this is actually an incredibly eventful month and in fact week in the history of the menthol cigarette. 1 month ago, the Food and Drug Administration, after having announced the intention of banning the menthol cigarette last year, submitted to the Office of Management and Budget proposed rules on the menthol cigarette. And many anticipate that the agency will follow through once they receive a report from OMB. Now, the step with OMB is really crucial because the office conducts an economic assessment. It's a necessary step whenever an executive branch agency is proposing a policy change with fiscal or economic implications. We don't know exactly what was submitted to OMB, but we do know that the FDA has received the response. And FDA has long promised to issue a ruling by the end of April 2022, that is to say this week, on whether they intend to ban the menthol cigarette. And I have heard from others who have been watching this space keenly that we should expect an announcement either on Thursday or on Friday. When the FDA submitted its proposed rules to OMB, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, in a press release, highlighted what many of us have come to know, which is they applauded the step of standing up to the tobacco industry and proposing what they regard as a bold, life-saving policy that will protect kids from tobacco addiction, advance health equity, and save lives, especially among Black Americans. They associate the cigarette, not in general, but the menthol cigarette in particular, as a major cause of health disparities. And the question that has been the source of ongoing controversy for the last, I would say, 10, possibly even 15 years, began in 2009 in the wake of the Congress passing a new law that granted for the first time ever the Food and Drug Administration authority to regulate tobacco. It's almost inconceivable that the Food and Drug Administration never had authority to regulate tobacco products until the first year of the Obama administration, when the Democrats also controlled Congress. Now, in the course of that legislation, all flavored cigarettes were banned as illegitimate enticements to smoking, but menthols were exempted. And the question of what to do with menthols was handed at that point to the FDA to decide. And so we might be in the week when the Food and Drug Administration finally makes a decision. Along the way, there have been debates in favor of a ban on menthol and those who oppose it. In favor of the ban have been public health advocates, epidemiologists, and many others from Black communities who point to specific reasons for banning. One being that since the 1960s, menthol brands have been marketed as refreshing and cool, and the market share has grown rapidly, and that more than 70%, upwards of 80% now of African-American smokers prefer menthol cigarettes as compared to 30%. And this has been the byproduct of a rather aggressive push to market menthols in Black communities since the 1960s. And so those who advocate for a ban point to these developments, pointing to the fact of how the tobacco industry has successfully positioned menthol products as young, hip, new, and healthy, really since the 1960s for subsequent generations of young Black would-be smokers. They also point to specific scientific evidence that suggests that menthols provoke deeper inhalation, and that the supposed anesthetic cooling that people feel produces a more difficulty quitting, and that menthol should be treated as other flavored cigarettes were. That is to say, they should be regarded, as they are, as illegitimate enticements to young people to start smoking. But the industry has argued, just as vociferously, that menthols should not be banned. A 2011 industry report on menthol argued that despite the fact that a disproportionate number of Black smokers prefer menthols compared to white smokers, the majority of all menthol smokers, because of course, whites are a majority or a significantly larger population than Blacks, a majority of all menthol smokers are white. They also argue that menthol is a legitimate flavor preference, and since the vast majority of African Americans prefer menthol smoking, is that preference should be honored as an inherent taste preference rather than something that has been kind of manufactured or foisted or created through illegitimate means. And then finally, they make the fascinating argument that menthols don't change the inherent health risks of smoking cigarettes. That is to say, menthols in themselves are not dangerous. And as a result, smoking a menthol cigarette is as dangerous to your health as smoking a non-menthol cigarette. So in order to weigh in on this question of whether the menthol cigarette should be banned, as a historian, I thought it would be important to consider its long historical trajectory by looking at how it is that menthol markets are created as a way of evaluating the arguments for banning and the arguments against. And so what I'd like to do today is to just describe to you what I have found by writing this book, which uses heavily the resources that were created in the wake of the Master Settlement Agreement, where the Department of Justice and states attorneys generals brought suit against the tobacco industry in the late 1990s. A settlement produced a massive archive that allows us to look inside the industry to look at this question of how menthol markets were created. And I would argue that once we understand how menthol markets are created and maintained, this is an added piece of evidence that should be brought to bear in the question of whether or not these menthol cigarettes should be banned. From the inception, menthol cigarettes began with a rather deceitful claim, a false promise of health. Menthol were seen as, we all know the experience of eating a mentholated, maybe chewing gum or having a product or using a toothpaste that has menthol. There's that distinctive feeling of a coolness wrapping itself around your nose and your throat. Now, it's important to understand that menthol doesn't actually change the temperature of your throat, but there is an interesting trick upon the senses that gives the sense of an anesthetic value. And it's this phenomenon that menthol cigarettes first embraced as a treatment for what was called smoker's throat in the earliest years of mentholated smoking. What I'll describe is these early years. I'll describe how it is that other health concerns, not just the smoker's throat that was caused by harsh cigarettes, but also the cancer scare, or at least the finding that cigarette smoking was linked to higher rates of cancer and then other forms of cardiovascular health disease, that suggested to many smokers that menthols were healthier. They're not. But the same therapeutic promise that was made in the early years proved to be very valuable for menthol brands in the 1950s as cancer concerns arose. It's in the 1960s that menthol makers began to pivot aggressively to racial advertising, beginning with Brown and Williamson, pitching a new kind of Kool cigarette for Black consumers, and studying aggressively Black culture, Black trend setting, the crossover appeal. And I argue it's in the 1960s that you begin to see a new strain of predatory racial capitalism that defines menthol marketing. In the 1970s and 1980s, I'll describe the way in which pushing Kool targeted what one industry called poverty markets with close scrutiny of taste, understandings of local influencers that can help those markets flourish. And especially in the context of a nationwide ban on television and radio advertising, in the early 1970s, you see the industry focusing ever more attentively on the creation of urban billboards and point of sale advertising to nourish and sustain menthol markets. And then I'll talk very quickly about the emergence of a critique, community resistance and the public health critique that would bring us to this moment in which we are now aware of all of the forces that have led to the building of menthol markets. And what I'd like to describe is the forces that have led to a wider array of bans embraced by cities and states, and ultimately to what I expect to happen later this week, which is the FDA announcement of a ban. So menthol cigarettes have traveled a long and complicated course in American society. It began with a product called Spud in 1926, and then Kool, marketed for the first time in the early 1930s, which, as I said, carried this deceptive promise of temporary relief for those who were suffering from what the makers of Spud and Kool called smoker's throat. Now, smoker's throat was a widespread concern, and companies were vying with each other, competing with each other to relieve smokers of harsh, cigarettes. And the menthol cigarettes emerged, with a promise that you see here advertised in the Chicago Tribune in 1947. Do you have smoker's throat? If you do, switch from hots to Kools. Or here, the Willie the Penguin, who was the spokesperson and mascot for Kool cigarettes through the 1950s. When April showers make you cough like crazy, refreshing Kools taste fresh as a daisy. Got a cough? Switch from hots to Kools. So here you see the way in which Kool and menthols in general came into the market promising a kind of cold relieving therapeutic bringing with it a therapeutic promise, not only for April showers, congestion, smoker's throat, et cetera. Now, most people in the industry, everyone in the industry understood that menthol did not have any therapeutic value at all. But the early building of a market really hinged on this therapeutic appeal that would continue, would sustain itself through the 1950s into the 1960s, and indeed still today. The market that menthols occupied in the 1930s and 40s was a temporary market. The idea was that you would turn to menthols for temporary relief from smoker's throat and then pivot back to your regular cigarette afterwards, or during rainy season, or when you were congested. And so it was always understood to be a break cigarette, a cigarette that you took because of congestion, because of irritated throats. It's what allows me to tell this story, as I mentioned before, is the 14 million industry documents that are now accessible online as a result of the master settlement agreement that was struck between the state's attorneys general, the Department of Justice, and the industry. And it's in this archive, which is searchable by anyone from their home computer, that you begin to see the way in which the industry drew upon social psychology, what was called psychographics, focus groups, polling, interviewing, surveys, sales and marketing analysis, and close study of local as well as national demographic trends, turning to companies like the Psychological Corporation, pollsters like Lewis Harris, and one company called the Institute for Motivational Research, to try to understand how you build markets on the basis of health anxieties and other kinds of status anxieties. They studied very closely health beliefs, but they also studied identity, masculinity, femininity, as I said, status anxiety. So poverty was not just a problem to be ameliorated. It was a phenomenon to be studied in order to understand how economic vulnerability laid the foundation for markets to be produced. They studied perception and persuasion and opportunities for what they called exploitation, not understood in the negative markets were there to be exploited in what they regarded to be the positive sense of the term. So this archive allows me to look behind the curtain, as it were, at the consultants, what Vance Packard, the journalist in the 1950s, called the hidden persuaders, like Ernest Dichter, the founder of the Institute for Motivational Research, urban studies scholars, social scientists of many stripes, studying how you make markets. What it also allows me to do is to study the competition between industries, companies like Brown & Williamson, R.J. Reynolds, and Philip Morris, which never really produced a successful menthol brand, but wanted to, and as a result, studied very, very carefully what made the other brands successful. It allows me to understand how the advertising ban in television and radios led to the rise of inner city billboards, the very billboards that Thomas Dodman described as defining my youth in the 1970s. In fact, what I argue in the book is that I came into the menthol story in what I argue is chapter 3 of this story. In some ways, the industry was doing behavioral psychological studies long before behavioral psychology existed as a field. And one of the things I argue in the book is that they were doing Black studies before Black studies existed as a field of academic study, but all in service of building markets, understanding taste, understanding gender, understanding the urban commercial world, understanding billboards and their appeal. So let me give you an example of some of the documents that you can find in this volume. As I said, Ernest Dichter is one character who shows up. And in the 1950s, menthols made a pivot in the wake of the discovery that cigarettes were linked to increasing rates of cancer, lung cancer, and then later heart and cardiovascular disease. And it's with the awareness that cigarettes were now a product associated with health anxiety that individuals like Ernest Dichter or other companies like the Market Planning Corporation began to study the role of new products like Salem, a new menthol brand from RJR that hit the market in the 1950s. And they began to understand that the appeal was an implicit health appeal. As Market Planning Corporation noted, for instance, Salem as a cigarette is a little more of an upper income bracket cigarette, but Kools, on the contrary, are seen very clearly as lower income cigarettes by smokers. A feeling that Kool is smoked by older and retired people. Kool still had that older veneer of having a kind of a 1930s break cigarette, highly medicated image. And both of these were trying to adapt to this new atmosphere of health anxiety. What Market Planning Corporation explained is that Kool and Salem smokers are acutely conscious of their health. The personality tests conducted showed that the menthol smokers' concern about their health is based on deeper lying aspects of their personalities. They are much more aware than the average person is of these issues of health, but yet they can neither give up smoking easily nor smoke without feeling some threat. Therefore, they compromise. And it's this understanding of menthol that became central to industry's understanding of the rise in the uptick in menthol smoking. As this study suggested, many of these smokers try to evade the issue raised by cancer research. In some, Salem smokers face a dilemma. He wants a great deal from his cigarette, and he is not prepared to give up some qualities. In the 1950s, the leading edge of menthol smoking was not a racial edge. It was a health concern. If you had said to a tobacco executive in the late 50s or even in the early 1960s that the future of menthol smoking would be in inner cities or among African Americans, they would look at you, quizzically. They wouldn't understand what you meant, because there were two markets they were focused on: the health conscious market, and, as this suggests, Salem focused on colleges, the youth market. Colleges were the leading edge of advertising for cigarettes in general, and menthol advertising in particular. And you see here the kinds of close studies that they were doing from campus to campus. They were doing advertisements in college newspapers. They were doing couponing. Students were hired as sales representatives. Free samples were being handed out. But during the 1950s, and early 1960s, there was increasing concern from a regulatory standpoint, from Congress and from states, that this constituted an illegitimate and deceptive and, in fact, scurrilous way to lure youth into long-term smoking. And faced with threats around this kind of advertisement for Kools in the 1950s and early 1960s, faced with what became clear that they would be faced with national regulations and bans on these practices, the industry decided to pull college advertisements in the early 1960s. So college papers suddenly could no longer look to tobacco ads for revenue. And with the decline of the teen and the teen smoking market, with the decline of the college market, this is where you begin to see the major pivot to cities in the 1960s. With increasing critique of the public youth-oriented marketing, the pivot to cities, the same strategies that were used on college campuses begin to focus relentlessly, using focus groups, psychographic studies, street corner interviews, studying status anxiety, health worries, gender concerns, perceptions of self and other. Alpine is a product made by Philip Morris, where they tried to use a strategy that had been successful for them in rebranding Marlboro in the 1950s. Marlboro had been earlier marketed as a Turkish blend that was appealing to women, but in the 1950s, Philip Morris aggressively masculinized Marlboro. And here you see them trying to do the same with menthol smoking, which never caught on, with a new brand called Alpine. This is the trend that was taken up by Brown and Williamson in the 1960s. This is the image that adorns the cover of my book. This is Bronzeville in 1960s Black Chicago. And these are the images that would come to dominate menthol marketing through the 50s, the 60s and 1970s. I want to just pause by giving you a sense of how these markets were built, and then later how the building of markets were sustained, by turning to one document that is part of this archive. It's a study that was done in Black St. Louis for the makers of Camel in November of 1967 by the company, the marketing firm of Dancer, Fitzgerald, and Sample. And it highlights not only the tailored, targeted marketing tactics of companies, the free samples that began the creation of habits and the building of markets, but it also highlights the importance of secretiveness in a particularly predatory strain of racial capitalism that I describe in a much more thoroughgoing way in the book. As the document says, this is to summarize our thoughts on a way to reach the Negro market for Camel menthol, and specifically what we recommend doing now in the Negro area of St. Louis. The document talks about understanding the generational tensions of the 1960s, that Negroes don't want what daddy used to smoke or drink, that's old-fashioned and lower class. They talked about the importance of appealing to Black pride and rejecting white standards in the 1960s. The Negroes no longer look to the white market and its purchasing norms and habits to set the pace in what to buy. Again, Negroes are becoming increasingly proud of the fact that they are Negroes, and they are now rejecting many of the standards or patterns set by the white community. The other thing that these researchers understood understood is that white youth were also emulating Black culture, Black music, and Black fashion. And so if one built a Black following for a brand, one was also in a kind of a secondhand way building a following among white youth. The document goes on to talk about how you impart prestige in a secret manner and how you find centers of influence in Black St. Louis. In both working and social situations, researchers learned, Negroes tend to gravitate to groups, and Negro men usually spend more time with their respective groups than the average white man, whether it be at bar, club meetings, on the street, or at their job. Within these groups, there are centers of influence, individuals who lead the others because they are, quote, are more in the know, or they are more forceful. These are not leaders in the sense of being president of the PTA or a local civic organization, but might well be a barber, a numbers man, a bellhop, a bartender. They're kingfish. They are the best means of spreading news. They have a strong desire for status and class. And what we do is we deliver free boast material to these cell groups, imparting prestige and factual knowledge in a personalized, almost secret manner, in addition to the product itself. And we must aim this promotional effort at the leaders and communicators within the Negro cell groups. The additional information given to these selected individuals is called boast material, in that it allows them to be in the know and brag to friends about the inside information on a particular brand. And the important feature here is that it should not be disclosed how the influence was made beyond these individual influencers. In other words, the idea that a company was behind this charade would instantly undermine the credibility. So what you find in the documents that make up my book is how industry closely studied race at very, very local levels. Local racism was also important. And they studied these in order to underpin buying behavior and guide advertising imagery. The industry remained alert to shifts in racial attitudes, sentiments, such as negative views of young whites about Black imagery in Kool ads. They studied resurgent racism. They understood where they could advertise these kinds of images and where, if one was more found the images of the Marlboro Man more alluring, why one could not engage in aggressive marketing in certain areas. So in the 1960s, with the increasing anxiety about kind of backlash in white ethnic America against civil rights, busing, and other indices of racial progress, companies also studied how feelings of racism, as this marketing plan noted, particularly anti-Black racism, are widespread in areas like Chicago among white people than in the country generally. And anti-Black feelings are also expressed in their dislike for integrated ads. So what they were studying constantly is shifts in attitudes, both white attitudes and Black attitudes, with regard to the creation of markets. Now, targeting took many different forms, as I mentioned. Even at the same time that national radio and television ads are being banned, this is the era of the increasing intensification of an urban focus with billboards, posters, public transit focus, point of sale outreach, and free samples. I'll just highlight one other kind of document from the 1980s, that is attention to the use of public transit, but with an eye towards race and racism. So here's a company that manufactured Newport cigarettes that was trying to hone in and become an increasing, and was in fact a growth brand for Menthols in the 1980s. And they studied very carefully the use of Black transit, particularly in Boston. And as this memo suggested, I do not recommend using Black creative, that is to say Black themed ads in Boston, because these buses serve white areas too. Of the three lines, 60%, 30%, and 20% respectively of their service areas are Black. This is in Boston. Conversely, the balance of the viewers are white. In this case, the spill is too sizable for my liking. You might question why 60% was an acceptable proportion for me to recommend using Black creative in DC while not in Boston. That is because in the South, menthol usage is extremely Black. In Boston, we run a greater risk of alienating our white franchise, white potential users. And so it's this intimacy of understanding commuter patterns that is striking in the creation and nurturing of menthol markets. In fact, there's a document in Pittsburgh that highlights that, Black riders on a particular commuter line are the prevalent riders of the bus. So advertising within the bus on Black-themed menthol, Black-themed menthol ads was not problematic, but advertising on the outside of the bus, those same images were problematic because those same buses traveled through white neighborhoods. What I want to highlight is that Big Tobacco had supporters for these strategies, particularly among African-American media figures like John H. Johnson, the producer of Ebony magazine, who understood the importance of relying on advertising dollars, relying on the industry for advertising. But he also understood that in a segregated society in the 1960s, as he wrote, patronizing a first-class eating establishment in a comfortable manner is not always easy for African-American consumers. Outlays of money for country clubs, resorts, and similar recreation in most instances is out of the question. Therefore, Negro Americans, he wrote, who are forced outside the mainstream of American life in so many ways, achieve what he called compensatory gratification in ways that often are surprising to the rest of America. And this is the kind of study of compensatory gratification, the psychology of menthol marketing that people like Ernest Dichter and other psychologists who studied cigarette buying habits were really focused on through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 1970s. Very quickly, to try to wrap up, I turn in the book to understanding how it is not just that markets were built and sustained, but how local activism emerged in the 1980s. This is one of the favorite characters that I have, my favorite characters in the book. His name is Henry Mcneill Brown, and he went by the name Mandrake in Chicago, and he began a kind of vigilantism. Well, not a kind of, he began to blackwash and whitewash billboards for alcohol and cigarettes across Chicago in the 1980s. He became but he is an example of a kind of community activism that began to push back against the prevalence of billboards, especially the disproportionate prevalence of tobacco and alcohol billboards in urban, so-called inner city contexts, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, and others. And you also see an upsurge in public health advocacy, public health criticism of this phenomenon as well. This comes to a head in a controversy around a particular campaign launched by R.J. Reynolds in 1990 to push a new menthol product called Uptown, first in, they were test marketing it in Philadelphia. And in some ways, the Uptown controversy is a major turning point in the history of menthol marketing. It exposed the industry's tactics. It showed the hidden supporters that helped to sustain these practices, and it also energized critics. It laid the groundwork also for what eventually came in the late 1990s, which is a ban on billboards. And there were unlikely foes against the Uptown campaign. So Uptown, as I said, was brought up by test marketed in Philadelphia by RJR, who announced this new brand and proudly pitched it not as a brand that they thought African Americans would be interested in, but a brand that was exclusively pitched to Black smokers. And this resulted in fierce criticism from George Herbert Walker Bush's Secretary for Health and Human Services, Louis Sullivan, who was a physician. He was a former dean, the founding dean of Morehouse College. And so here you have this phenomenon of a business-friendly Republican administration whose Secretary for Health and Human Services comes out against a specific brand and a particular menthol pitch. As he's quoted here in the Wall Street Journal as saying, Uptown's message is more disease, more suffering, and more death for a group already bearing more than its share of smoking-related illness and mortality. But surprisingly, to many, Uptown also had its defenders. The industry had its defenders. And Benjamin Hooks, the executive director of the NAACP, came out in favor of the right of industry to market products. He, in fact, argued that critics were racist in arguing that Black people could not make up their minds for themselves. Of course, at this very moment, the NAACP was turning to the industry, much like Ebony had, for financial support to help to sustain civil rights activities in the 1980s and 1990s. So the history of menthol is the history of tensions within the Black community, wherein the industry has supported civic organizations, Ebony Magazine, radio and television ads being banned, supporting jazz festivals, and supporting NAACP for many, many years. So when President Obama was elected and Democrats controlled Congress, and it seemed very clear that the Food and Drug Administration would be finally granted authority to regulate tobacco and that flavored cigarettes would be banned. It was once again elected officials who were supported by the industry, like Adolphus Towns, the Democrat from Brooklyn, who was known as Congress's Marlboro Man, who stood in the way of a menthol ban. And one of the chief architects for this legislation, Henry Waxman, was unwilling to risk the bill's the bill's passage, and so conceded to individuals like Adolphus Towns that menthol would be exempt from the flavor ban. Menthol remained legal but also punted, the legislation punted the question to the Food and Drug Administration, where it has resided ever since. The FDA acted shortly thereafter to ban the menthol cigarette, and it were taken to court. Through a long series of processes, they backed off. In 2018, the then FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb under the Trump administration announced to ban on menthol, and then he left office shortly thereafter. So this is easily the third time around. It's a long road to the ban of the menthol. And so I'll end by actually pointing out that the long road to that I end the book by talking about how the menthol cigarette should be understood in our time. Those who criticize the FDA and criticize bans are often use the specter of men like Eric Garner, who was strangled to death on the streets of Staten Island for selling loosies. They often hold up people like Eric Garner or George Floyd as the kinds of people who would be victimized in the wake of a menthol ban. But really, they have the story wrong. The way we should understand the history of menthol is that menthol is part of the long road to I Can't Breathe. When I was finishing the conclusion of the book, COVID struck, disproportionately taking Black lives, and police violence was on the upsurge with the killing, culminating with the killing of Mr. Floyd. And all of these have one thing in common with menthols. They all end in the cry, in a decimation of the lungs, and the cry, I can't breathe. The difference being that police violence of the kind that killed George Floyd occurred over the course of minutes. Disproportionate death from COVID occurs over the course of weeks and sometimes months. But the problem with menthol is that the crippling ability, the fact that it cripples the ability to breathe happens over a different time scale. It happens not over minutes or weeks or months, but in fact decades. And the perpetrator is not caught on video. So my book ends with the long road to I Can't Breathe to point out that it is in fact the industry that has had its foot on the neck, its arm around strangling African Americans very quietly with supporters over the course of many decades. And that is rightly how we should understand the history of the menthol cigarette in Black America and why we should embrace what is to come in a few days' time, which is a ban on this product. I'll then end there. And I probably went on a bit too long, but happy to.
That was absolutely fine. Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith, for that wonderfully rich presentation that I think really manages to capture so much of the book, which is such a big book with so much going on in it. While people sort of gather their thoughts to and want to ask questions in the Q&A, I'll maybe jump in because I mean, for me, this is such a wonderful example of it's so many histories all at once, right? It's a history of medicine, a history of sciences, of the social sciences, of creation of knowledge, and how they get sucked into histories of capitalism, of a history of a particular predatory form of capitalism, of marketing, and of course of racial capitalism, which is sort of the heart of the book. And so one way I think maybe to sort of ask a question, or rather just to sort of get you to expand on one of the things that I found really most fascinating in the book is how you show how what is really a kind of aggressive push towards the creation of taste, right? There's a fabrication of taste, a production of taste, and it's a push factor, gets turned around and naturalized into a pull factor, right? So that there's an inherent Black taste for menthol, and that's the way it's presented, but the whole situation's kind of been flipped around. And so what that enables you to do is through these various vectors show how race is a social construction, and but in a particular sort of very concrete example, how it actually gets constructed and then turned into something natural that we can use and exploit and police and do all sorts of things with. So I wonder if you could just expand on this, what I saw as a very Bourdieusian sort of a production of taste sort of aspect of the book.
Absolutely. And you know, I start the book with a skit that Dave Chappelle does, where he says to, it's a show he has called, you know, asking white contestants, do you know Black people? And one of the questions he puts to them is, why do Black people love menthols? And of course, there's something fundamentally wrong with the question, because Black people don't love menthols. Most Black people don't smoke cigarettes at all. But he engages, he actually posits that there is this affinity. And when people answer the question, it doesn't matter what they say. He says, nobody knows. It's a mystery. Well, what, as you say, the book allows us to do is to look at a period before that was true, and then to look at the circumstances that made that true, and to look at the vast machinery that is necessary for making it not only true, but a sustained truth. And for that to be the case, you need those studies in Black St. Louis, but you also need the silence and participation of Ebony. You need the people like Adolphus Towns, who are being paid by the industry to make that argument so that menthols are exempted. So no one would say that kids have an inherent love of strawberry cigarettes, right? No one would say that women have an inherent love of menthol cigarettes, even though gender and women were, but there is this kind of convenient biologization of Black identity that allows the market of menthols to both be built and sustained. And as you say, that it's really important to show that process. And it's really the lawsuits of the late 1990s that allow us to see that process, and therefore to not naturalize taste, but to understand taste as not just also a construction, but something that has to be sustained. That the machine, the amount of work it takes to sustain this conceit of menthols being natural is just extraordinary.
Right, and one of the amazing things that you show in this sustaining of the naturalization of taste, right, is how good the various institutions, corporations, people that are at play in this story can turn a crisis into an opportunity, right? There's that sort of famous motto of never let a crisis go to waste, or whatever. I'm paraphrasing, but moments where a market seems to be dying out become an opportunity to find another market and sort of flip things around. So that was an amazing kind of thing that the book shows, I think.
Yeah, it's not that often that we can look at these processes within, I mean, most corporate archives are closed, right? We're actually seeing one right now because of the lawsuits that are brought against the makers of OxyContin. There are comparable archives being created. And so similarly, we see the machinery that's necessary to produce an opioid crisis. And it's not just the story of users who seek a drug. You need a wide range of actors, including like McKinsey, the consulting firm, right, that settled in lawsuits because of their role in coming up with the marketing strategies for supercharging the opioid crisis. So I think we're at a point now where we are able to see some of these processes.
Right, yeah, thank you. I have a question from Arden, and then I know Rishi wants to ask a question too, but I'm going to read out Arden's. It's to follow up on my question. I wondered if you, Keith, might be able to tell us more about the aggressive market research tactics that the cigarette companies used to create new categories of users.
So, I could tell you, I encourage you to look at the book. In the 1950s, for instance, in the context of what the industry labeled the cancer scare, and they thought about it as a psychological phenomenon. They didn't think about it as like an epidemiological finding. They thought about it as a finding that was producing a psychological response. And it's in that context that they began to understand that the menthol smoker was a type. And so you find studies of the psychology of menthol smoking previously, and some of these are feminized images, as in, real men in the 1950s aren't going to admit that they're afraid of this cancer news. But there is a type of person that is concerned, but wants to be masculine and doesn't want to be understood as a sissy about it. And menthol needs to appeal. So the alpine image that I showed you emerges in that time period, right, in which they're trying to say, you can be a real man and you can smoke menthols. And we have to be able to convey. So there's a lot of gender and masculinity themes that run through this in order to create these markets. So there are companies like the Psychological Corporation, the Institute for Motivational Research, who are all interested in masculinity and gender as a foundational element. There's another fascinating study that Philip Morris does to try to understand why the cowboy imagery does not appeal in in urban settings. And what they say is, for white men, the image of the cowboy and the dominance of the environment that lone cowboy on a horse represents is a kind of appealing escape. But Black men in cities want to have control over their local environment. And so there's these very careful studies of what masculinity means in Black America and what masculinity means in white suburban America that should underpin advertising and should explain why it is that you can never sell menthols or Marlboro menthols in the city with a Black cowboy. What you should do is show a Black woman looking admiringly at a Black man in an urban context, because that's the kind of control that urban Black men, they say, want to both experience and embody.
That's amazing. Yeah. Rishi, please.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. I think that this conversation about, questions around naturalization, biologization of taste really kind of resonate with me, because it's one of the things that I think is hardest for people to understand, especially students in the kind of biological fields. And I don't think it's out of some it's not out of from a bad place, right? But it's this circumstance of thinking that everything is somehow got kind of organic or innate causes, and we're trying to work through this. I think the question that you brought up about the opiates seems very important here, because for me, what I in reading your book and thinking about it is how, like, if you could talk a little bit more about how the kind of medical community was involved in the question around menthol, right? Because we think about Vicks Vapor Rub or these kinds of other ways in which menthol is this medical space, like how that plays. That'd be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So menthol. So I would very quickly describe how menthols occupied this health space at a time when there was a lot of anxiety about the health effects of smoking before the cancer scare in the 1920s and 30s. And doctors were part of endorsing. They're very famous, when more doctors smoke Camels, right? Doctors were part of the endorsement of certain kinds of products as being less irritating on the throat than others, right? So physicians kind of enter the story as helping to reassure. In the 1950s, the Philip Morris and other companies are very proud of the way they continue to court physicians at their meetings and to support them, and to support studies of menthol. And this, you see this in the 1950s in my book as well. In some ways, they help, the industry is very interested in courting physicians to stay on the sidelines on the smoking question. That is to say, many of my colleagues like Robert Proctor and others highlight that one of the major products of the tobacco industry was doubt. That is to say, not saying cigarettes don't cause cancer, but saying we don't know enough. And physicians were part of that story as well. What's happened since the 1960s with the Surgeon General's report, and then the 70s and 80s, is the accumulation of evidence over decades of the devastating impact of smoking on all manner of health. And so over the course of the century, you've seen a shift in both public health and medical understanding, which basically now says unambiguously, right, that there is no ambiguity about the health effects of smoking. And that has in some ways helped to shift the ground, so that when Louis Sullivan speaks out from the Bush administration in 1990 about Uptown, he is speaking he's speaking for a kind of a unified position that physicians have about the health effects of smoking. But it took decades for that shift to happen. And for much of that history, physicians were either supporting the industry or supporting the idea that there could be safe smoking, or on the sidelines, embracing the idea of uncertainty and doubt.
We've been given a green light for a few more minutes. And we've just received a question. So I'll ask that from Michelle Haywood. What are the other health risks products that are promoted in similar predatory products to subgroups? Do they use similar tactics? How do we acknowledge autonomy in these groups? And I suppose I could actually throw in my follow-up question to that, which is, if we take this, a little too serious, well, not, I mean, we should take it very seriously, but isn't there a risk that in pulling all these threads of collusion between the scientific community, doctors, marketing agencies, and big tobacco companies, where do we stop? Or what arguments do we have against the people who say, well, the scientists don't know what they're saying about COVID anyway, and they're probably all funded by the laboratories, and so it's all a hoax. You see what I'm saying? I mean, when does the deconstruction become risky in the present, so to say? I mean, which I think is a sort of follow-up to Michelle's question.
Yeah. So to answer your question first, what I would say is that it's very important that we understand the kind of social processes that produce the truths that we embrace, not necessarily only to criticize. In other words, if you pull back the curtain on the production of COVID vaccines, if you pull back the curtain on NIH, and there's a transparency there, I would argue that you would end up with greater faith in the legitimacy of the knowledge that is being produced, and in fact, more information about about whether to take the shot or not. Right? What the industry, the tobacco industry, has done is really conceal. The private sector is not in the business of sharing openly the processes of producing these kinds of products. So, in some ways, what I try to do with this book is to say, if you pull back the curtain, what do you see? And it's what you see that should undermine your confidence in the menthol product, right? It's the way in which exploitation and manipulation work behind the scenes that look like a thoroughly illegitimate process to me. And so a lot of what I try to do in the book is that. The other health products, so there's an excellent book on the history of the Golden Arches, on the building of the fast food enterprise. Certainly alcohol advertisements in urban settings would follow. But the problem there is whether you look at like sodas, the soft drink industry, if you look at alcohol industry, if you consider all of the kinds of things that have proliferated in what are often called food deserts, it gives you a clear sense of how inequalities of diet and taste are manufactured. The problem is that we can't study these other industries as easily as we can the tobacco industry, because it takes a certain kind of action on the part of the state to move against these industries before we can see the processes most clearly. And so that it's no coincidence that it's in the wake of settlements and class actions and actions on the part of government that you can start to see, rather than just alleging what Purdue Pharma has done to help create the opioid market. Now we can actually see it because it's documentable. And so that's one of the unfortunate features of the story, is that sometimes this is a story that you can only tell in the wake of a transformation in the way we think about where ill health is produced.
Which is also a sort of ode for the importance of archives, right? And what we can do with archives for a history of the present in sort of contemporary debates.
That's right.
Yeah. I don't know if there are any, we've gone a bit over. I'm happy to take one more question if there is, but if there isn't, Rishi, I'll turn it over to you. But thank you so much.
While we wait for a second, but I think we can just all be here and kind of thank Keith for being here, Thomas for moderating. Beyond important, but I think this sort of gives us a sense of kind of why we're here and why we're trying to do these kinds of things. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you to the attendees for participating, and thanks, Thomas, for moderating.
Thank you.